Genesis chapter 3 introduces the struggle of history as being a war between the woman and the serpent, and between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed. In the last chapter, in Revelation 12, we've seen the battle between the woman and the serpent. And now in chapter 13, we see the battle between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed. But before we can get into the text, we need to look at some things in the book of Daniel that will show up in the book of Revelation. This will be helpful for our interpretation. Daniel declared, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke it in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in his horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." If we were studying the book of Daniel, we would interpret all these things in detail. But since we are only drawing on imagery in the book of Daniel to assist us in reading the book of Revelation, we only need to make a couple of points. First of all, each one of these beasts represents a political empire. A lion with eagle's wings was one of the official emblems of the Babylonian Empire. The slow-moving but powerful empire of Persia is represented as a bear, and the Empire of Greece is represented as a 4-headed leopard. The reason it has 4 heads is because after Alexander the Great died, the kingdom was divided into 4 kingdoms. It's a fast-moving animal, a leopard with wings, because of how quickly Alexander the Great conquered the known world. And then you have the 10-horned beast. And interpreters have never agreed about this. Is this the Seleucid kingdom, which persecuted the Jewish people and precipitated the Maccabean revolt in the 160s BC, where we get Hanukkah? Or is this a reference to Rome? Now, for our purposes, we don't need to resolve this issue. We just need to recognize that these different animal characteristics belong to different empires at different periods in history. We need to recognize one more feature of Daniel's prophecy because it will help us in the book of Revelation. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall rise out of the earth. So you can tell in chapter 17 that the beasts represent individual kings. But then you look in verse 23. Thus he says, "As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth." And so we see that the symbolism is very fluid. Sometimes a beast can represent just the king, or a beast can represent the entire kingdom. All right? And you have to use context to determine whether it's one way or the other. The same thing happens in the book of Revelation. Sometimes the beast is going to be the entire beast empire, and sometimes the beast is going to just be the king over that empire, the Antichrist figure. And so Revelation does not have different terminology for the empire versus the emperor, for the kingdom versus the Antichrist. And the reason is because it draws on the book of Daniel, which also does not make that distinction. You have to use context to tell whether we're talking about just an individual beast, an individual personal beast, or whether we're talking about the collective beast of the empire. With those 2 things in mind, we're prepared to read our text in Revelation. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her seed, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opens its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also it was given to it to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, every one whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faithfulness of the saints. It states specifically that the dragon is standing on the sand. This echoes a promise made to Jacob back in Genesis chapter 32. But you said, "I will surely do you good, and make your seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." Demonic parody is a prevalent theme in this chapter. Thus, the dragon stands on the sand of the shore because we are about to meet his seed. All right? So, sand, due to passages in Genesis, sand is sort of a metonym for offspring. That is, it's an associated idea. Righteous seed is going to be like the sand that is on the shore. Well, throughout this chapter, the devil is going to parody whatever God has done in history, whether it be the death and resurrection of Christ. We'll see in chapter 17 that he's going to parody the second coming of Christ. And right here, he's parodying the promises made to Jacob by God. Jacob would have seed as the sand of the sea. Well, now the devil is on the shore because he is about to summon his own child, his own offspring, up out of the ocean. And so the idea of sand is present here because he is parodying what God has done. God has brought about a seed in the earth, and so now the devil will do the same. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. The political child looks like its satanic father. The reason I say it's a political child is because we have already seen from the book of Daniel that these beasts represent kingdoms or empires. And it's interesting here that the seed of the devil is going to take a political form, a political nation state. Now, this should not surprise us. Remember back in Luke chapter 4, Satan said all the nation states, all the countries of the world were in his hand. And he told Jesus, "If you worship me, I will give these to you." And so this is very consistent with what we see in the Gospels, that the political realm is the satanic domain. And so Satan introduces his child to the world, and it takes a political form. Also notice that the dragon had 7 heads and 10 horns, and so the beast naturally is going to have 7 heads and 10 horns because it looks like its father. The names of blasphemy. The Roman emperor was called Son of God, the Lord, High Priest, the Savior, the only name under heaven by which men are saved, King of Kings, and the Emperor Domitian, who was the emperor at the time that the book of Revelation was written, he wanted to be called God and Lord. And so these are obviously blasphemous titles which the head of state has taken upon himself. Now, it would be a mistake to take the names of blasphemy on the beast and strictly relegate them to the first century Roman Empire. Rather, If a name is written on something in the book of Revelation, it reveals its inner character. The name of God is written on God's people in this book because it reveals our inner character. The name of the beast is written on his followers in this book because it reveals their inner character. There are names written on the woman in chapter 17 because it reveals her character. And so what this refers to is any political state, any power that will give itself honors and titles that are so glorious that they belong to God alone. Smalley says that the sea is the residence of demons, as well as the lapping shores of all the provinces in the Roman Empire. Recall that when Jesus cast the demon out of the demoniac, the demons go into the herd of swine and rush off into the sea. Throughout the book of Revelation, but actually the whole Bible, the sea has been associated with chaos and rebellion, and it's taken on demonic connotations. Now consider this from John's perspective. He's on an island. He is surrounded by the sea. And in fact, the known world, the Mediterranean world in which John lived, everywhere the sea was, everywhere the sea touched the shore, that is where Rome had dominion. And we will see especially in chapters 17 and 18 that Rome, which has dominion over the sea, shares in the spiritual essence of the sea, shares in its demonic substance, in its demonic soul. We continue the numerical story of Revelation, remembering that squares represent righteous numbers, triangular numbers are evil, and rectangular numbers are a combination of both. Now, we introduced a triangle in the last chapter, the 10 horns for the dragon. Now, his child looks like him, so the beast also has 10 horns. Since it's both a reference to 10 horns, I just put them both in the same triangle. I didn't give the 10 horns of the beast its own triangle. I just put them in there with the dragon. And so 10 is a triangular number and therefore is an evil number in this book. And as we go, we will add additional shapes to this slide. Virtually every Revelation teacher knows that the beast here in Revelation 13 draws on the beast imagery back in the book of Daniel. Now, what is less commonly known is that the two beasts in Revelation 13 are the same as the two beasts in the book of Job. We have here in Revelation one beast that comes up out of the land and one beast that comes up out of the sea. Now, this is interesting because in the book of Job, we have the same thing. And you will recall that in this book, Job has his children taken away, he has his health taken away, his wealth taken away, because Satan instigates a test of Job in the heavenly court. And Job spends the duration of the book arguing with his friends who think that Job is the blame, that he has been disobedient, and these things have come upon him as punishment. At the end of the book, God shows up and gives a monologue about creation. Instead of answering their philosophical questions, God has his own discussion on the creation. And he ends with a narration on two beasts that God has created. Job 40 through 41 narrates two beasts that God created, Leviathan and Behemoth. In Jewish tradition, these two came to be associated with demonic opponents who would be consumed at the final banquet. A lot of modern Westerners, when we read this text, we immediately begin to think like biologists. Well, what species of animals are these here in the book of Job? Are these a great whale? Are these crocodiles, etc.? And none of those designations really fit. If you know anything about creationism, you know that they will oftentimes try to use Job 40 and 41 to show that the Bible actually has dinosaurs. The last I heard is that Leviathan in Job chapter 41 was supposed to be a plesiosaur. Now, what we want to do, if we want to understand what the book of Revelation is doing with these two beasts, is we want to put aside our modern Western categories of biology and paleontology and the modern argument between evolution and creationism, because the ancient Jews had their own way of thinking about these two beasts. It was not biology and dinosaurs. when they thought about these two beasts, they had come to take on these demonic connotations, and they were part of what was called the combat banquet motif, that these two creatures would be defeated at an end-time combat at the time of the Messiah, and then they would be eaten by the righteous in the Messianic age. And so I want to look at some key texts from the ancient Jewish corpus which speaks to these beliefs. 4th Ezra, which is an apocalypse written in the 1st century, just like Revelation, it says, "Then you kept in existence two living creatures, the one you called Behemoth, and the name of the other Leviathan. And you gave Behemoth one of the parts that had been dried up on the third day, to live in it, where there are 1,000 mountains. But to Leviathan you gave the watery part, and you have kept them to be eaten by whom you wish, and when you wish." So notice here, the land monster and the sea monster are going to be consumed. They're going to be eaten at some future period of time. Same thing in 2nd Baruch, another 1st century text. "The Messiah shall begin to be revealed, and Behemoth shall be revealed from his place, and Leviathan shall ascend from the sea. Those two great monsters which I created on the 5th day of creation, and shall have kept until that time, and then they shall be food for all that are left." So when the end of the age arrives, and you have the land beast and the sea beast, well, when the Messiah is revealed, these monsters are revealed. And notice that they become food for those who are left in the Messianic age. One more text, we will look at the book of Enoch. "And on that day, two monsters will be separated from one another, a female monster, whose name is Leviathan, to dwell in the depths of the sea, above the springs of waters. And the name of the male is Behemoth, who is held in a mountain on an immense desert. And the angel of peace who was with me said to me, These two monsters are prepared for the great day of the Lord, when they shall be turned into food." So we find several strains of this idea. We have the sea beast, we have the land beast from the book of Job. They have been separated, and at the end of the age, they will be defeated and eaten. Now, the book of Revelation seems to have its own version of this tradition. We see here in Revelation 13 that you have a beast from the land and a beast from the sea, and they are working together. This is interesting because the rabbis in the Talmud, they state that if Leviathan and Behemoth should ever be coupled together with one another, they would destroy the whole world. So the rabbis understood that Behemoth and Leviathan, they should be kept apart, because if they're together, they're very dangerous. Well, notice that is exactly what we have in Revelation 13. The land beast and the sea beast are going to work together. But is there a banquet motif in the book of Revelation? Does the demise of the two beasts, in other words, coincide with a great dinner? Well, this is what we find later on in Revelation 19. "Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly directly overhead, 'Come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great.' And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies, gathered to make war against him who is sitting on the horse and against his army." In other words, the angel knows that the fight is over before it begins, and that it's going to be time for a great supper. Now, it's not exactly the way the other Jewish sources have it, because the other Jewish sources have the righteous eating these monsters. Well, the book of Revelation has these birds eating these monsters. This idea of the birds eating the enemies of God comes from the book of Ezekiel. So we have a number of ideas that are coinciding here in the book of Revelation. But nevertheless, this combat banquet motif, that the two monsters from the book of Job will be killed and eaten at the culmination of the age, this will supply a lot of the imagery in the book of Revelation, and this is why we have one beast coming up out of the sea and one coming out of the land. If you're a first century person who's educated in Jewish things, you would read Revelation 13 and you would immediately think of this combat banquet motif. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his throne, and great authority. We have the different animal characteristics that belong to different empires have all been combined into a single beast here in the book of Revelation. Now, the most common interpretation for this is that this is one beast that will exist at the end of the age, which has all the terribleness of these of its predecessors. The leopard that represent the uh, uh, Greek Empire is on this beast because it will have the terribleness of Greece. It has the terribleness of Persia, and so it has the head of the bear. And it has all these different animal characteristics from these different empires because it's as terrible as all of them combined. That is a very common interpretation. It's not one that I hold, as I'll explain in a moment. Another idea, which is much less popular, there's a popular level prophecy teacher, Walid Shubat, who teaches that the beast represents a final Islamic empire, which has the combined territory of these previous empires. In other words, the final Islamic empire will have the territory that belonged to Greece, that belonged to Rome, that belonged to Persia, and that belonged to Babylon, etc. Now, I suggest that the beast represents a transhistorical presence. In other words, the beast is not locked in one corner in history, whether it be Rome in the first century or whether it be the kingdom of the Antichrist in the final 7 years, but rather the beast is transhistorical. That is, he exists throughout history in multiple different political forms, multiple countries. He always shows up someplace as a persecuting presence against God's people. The integration of different animal characteristics from Daniel 7 that represented successive empires in history demonstrates that the beast, like the dragon, is transhistorical. Just as the dragon has been identified as ancient in chapter 12 because he spans history all the way back to the Garden of Eden, so the beast has always been present in history and therefore takes on the symbolic characteristics of several different empires from several different time periods. The beast is not just one empire confined to a single era in history. Every empire in history used by Satan to persecute God's people was the beast, both before Rome and after Rome. Every political empire that persecutes God's people is the beast because they're all made in the image of the dragon. Revelation 13 is trying to tell us that the beast not only shares the dragon's image, but also shares in his lifespan, which stretches across millennia. So if you want to show that the devil's child, the beast, always exists in history, always persecuting God's people in one political form or another, one way to do this is to give this beast characteristics from different periods in history. So he was around in the time of Greece, so he gets the leopard characteristics. He was around in the time of Persia. He gets the bear characteristics. He was around in the time of Babylon. He gets the lion characteristics. You need to understand, John is trying to help us understand that the beast is not just in one period in history. He is transhistorical. He takes on many forms, and therefore he has created a beast here, which is a combination of characteristics that come from different periods in human history. The dragon, the woman seed, and several other icons from this section are transhistorical. Now, if you know the dragon, the woman, if these other symbols represent something that exists throughout history for millennia, we're not going to get to this one beast and be like, oh, well, this is just a final 7-year beast. No, no, no. It's got to fit the context. It's got to be transhistorical, like every other symbol in this context. The seed of the woman was both Christ and the church. We share a common symbol with Christ as the woman's seed because we are his body, his organism, his presence. The reason the church exists is to continue the miracle of the incarnation for the benefit of those who did not get to meet the historical Jesus in his lifetime. Likewise, the reason the beast exists as the serpent seed is to perpetuate the incarnation of Satan throughout history in the form of nation states that are hostile to the church. I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. Now we are going to see later on that the heads of the beast represent different kings. So here one of the kings has received a wound as unto death, uh, but was healed and continued to live. Now obviously this is a counterfeit of the death and resurrection of Christ. Jesus dies and is raised from the dead, and so now this king has his own version of this, because the devil is always copying and parodying what God has accomplished in history. The Emperor Nero cannot explain all of the data in the book. Nevertheless, this imagery for the Antichrist as someone who dies and comes back to life, this imagery draws heavily on Emperor Nero's story. We will find direct references to Emperor Nero later on in chapter 13. We will find references to Emperor Nero in chapter 17. And if we are going to understand this section of the book of Revelation, we need to have Emperor Nero in our heads. We need to be familiar with his story. And so we want to take an excursus to get familiar with Emperor Nero, to get familiar with the way the early church thought of him, and how he contributes to the beast imagery that we will find in the book of Revelation. Nero went down in history as the emperor who bankrupted the provinces with expensive building projects. The economy fell on hard times in Nero's day, and he took a number of measures to meet the problem. He devalued the Roman currency for the first time in the empire's history. He reduced the denarius from 3.85 grams to 3.35 grams. In other words, he reduced it by half a gram. He also reduced silver purity from 99% to 93%. And so in the middle of all these efforts to stave off the troubles of the economy, not inflation but deflation, he ends up making a number of bad economic choices to glorify himself. He built a colossus of himself that is almost 100 feet high, which you can see here on the left. Now, this thing didn't survive. It was probably destroyed in the fall of Rome in the year 410. But the interesting thing about this is that this statue is not an isolated thing. It was part of what was called the Golden House. Nero built a massive complex which had, groves and gardens and an artificial lake, and he had theaters, and it was just this wonderful construction. And he had to drive the provinces further into bankruptcy in order to make this happen. I mean, he really choked the empire dry. They already had a massive economic recession, and then he did all these expensive building projects, which proved to be very foolish and proved to be his downfall in the end. His feats of cruelty were notable, especially the murder of his own mother, Agrippina. Now you can see a coin here of the Emperor Nero with his mother. Now, this is not usually like this. You don't usually have coins in the ancient Roman Empire where the emperor is on an equal footing with his mother. And this is because Agrippina ruled her son and ruled through him. She was very controlling, and she was full of political intrigues in order to get him on the throne. And she was kind of cold and politically calculated. At least that's the sense you get from the historical sources. And she got Nero onto the throne, and then she basically wanted to be the emperor and wanted him to just do what she said. And he did for a while, under her hand and under the Stoic philosopher Seneca, etc. The initial years of Nero's reign were successful. But then his cruelty began to show, and he wanted to emancipate from her, and he turned to a life that she didn't like. He was engaged in entertainment. Nero was an athlete, a musician. He could play the harp. He could sing. He spent a lot of time at the games doing things that emperors were supposed to be more serious-minded than this. They're supposed to be taking care care of the affairs of the state. But Nero was too focused on entertainment and trying to be some sort of an actor slash musician. He also started having an affair with a slave girl named Acte. And for an emperor to have an affair on his wife with a slave girl, even in the pagan world, was considered immoral. And so his mother didn't like this, and she grew closer to his wife that he was cheating on, Octavia. And Nero didn't like this. He didn't trust his mother. We don't know all the reasons why he killed her, but he eventually set her up to die in a shipwreck. But she survived the shipwreck and managed to swim all the way to shore, where Nero's dispatch killed her there on the spot. So Nero was well known in the ancient world for his cruelty, especially toward his mother. But it wasn't just his mother. He's reported to have kicked one of his wives to death, Poppaea, just 3 months before she gave birth to his child. So definitely not a great and wonderful man by any stretch. Shortly after her death, Nero forced the effeminate man Sporus into castration and then into marriage. So apparently this man had soft features, right? And Nero liked that, and so he cut off his junk and made the guy be his wife. And Sporus had a long and tragic history. He was Nero's wife, and then after Nero died, and Sporus was there when Nero was killed, Sporus was there for all of that. Sporus would later on, after Nero died, the Roman Empire went into civil war, into chaos, and for a period of a year, different claimants laid hands on the throne. One of them was a guy named Otho, and so he took Sporus to be his lover. And so Sporus was with Emperor Nero, and then he was with Otho, who was emperor for only a few months. After Otho was killed, Otho was replaced by Vitellius, and Vitellius was going to use Sporus as a victim in a gladiatorial rape game. Right, so Sporus was going to be raped in public, and so Sporus killed himself in order to avoid the shame. It's always interesting to me when you read stories like this from history, because in the modern world, there are people who think of homosexuality as sort of a beautiful picture of liberation or something like that. But there have been times in Western civilization where homosexuality happened in various forms, and it was never a beautiful picture of liberation. It always coincided with something dark. And quite honestly, if you've spent much time with the modern gay community, and you've spent as much time at gay bars as I have, and with people from that lifestyle, you know that the gay lifestyle always coincides with something dark. Obviously, I don't want to especially point them out because there are plenty of straight people involved in darkness. But this notion that homosexuality is this beautiful act of liberation that so much of the modern culture is bought into is just self-deception. It is not the wonderful thing that the media will portray it to be. Why do we care about Nero? After all, a lot of the Roman emperors had their issues. A lot of them were cruel. A lot of them were sexually immoral. Maybe some of them more than Nero. So why are we pointing out Nero? Well, Nero's story coincided with the story of the early church in a major way at the time of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Nero either started or escalated an already existing fire in Rome to make room for his building projects. Now, of the ancient sources, Tacitus is the only surviving source which does not blame Nero for starting the fire. He says very simply that he is unsure whether he started it or not. But Suetonius and Cassius are quite clear that Nero started the fire. He had oftentimes decried, how ugly some parts of Rome were and how he would like to rebuild them. And so starting this fire could clear the room for him to do so. The fire is reported to have burned for over a week. It destroyed 3 of 14 Roman districts and severely damaged 7 more. So you have 14 districts. 10 of them are affected. 3 of them are destroyed. 7 of them are simply damaged. This only leaves 4 out of 14 districts unscathed by this fire. And modern archaeology has been able to corroborate these ancient reports that the fire was really bad. Nero pinned blame for the fire on the Christians. They were easy scapegoats because they were a minority that were disliked and distrusted by the major culture. This led to the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, according to early church sources. Christians were crucified, torn by wild beasts in the arena, and set on fire in Nero's garden to provide light. Now, a movie came out recently that is still in the theaters called Paul the Apostle, and I went to it thinking that it was going to cover the story of Paul throughout the book of Acts and throughout his ministry, but that's not the case. The whole movie is just the Great Fire of Rome, and it follows the persecution of the church after the Great Fire of Rome. And usually I don't like these old Bible movies because they're corny, they're not well done, the actors don't seem very seasoned, but this one was actually very good. Had Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, only in this movie he's played by Luke. And you can see the church struggling. Should we revolt in violence against our persecutors, or should we follow the teachings of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount? Even though, as it shows you in the movie, many people are being killed, including Christian children. But Paul, of course, resists the way of violence. He's eventually put to death, and Priscilla and Aquila also resist the way of violence and end up saying that if any Christian chooses to retaliate in a violent way, they have to leave the Christian community. But anyway, I don't like a lot of these movies, but I recommend seeing that one. If you have any interest in understanding what a huge moment this was for the early church, the Great Fire of Rome under Emperor Nero, you need to see that movie because it's pretty well done. Nero supposedly played his harp while the city burned. Modern historians think these accounts are exaggerated. Uh, they prefer accounts where Nero helped to look for victims and lend aid out of his own pocket, etc. You could say that maybe the fire got out of hand and it killed more people than Nero wanted. You could say that Nero went out and um, looked for people to cover up his own tracks and think he did wrong, etc. Nobody can be sure. In 68, Nero was declared an enemy of the state and fled for his life, taking only 4 loyal companions with him. He woke up in the palace at about midnight to find not only his guards were gone, the entire palace was gone. He just walked through the empty palace and found that he had been completely neglected. And they all left him behind, just left him vulnerable, clearly so that if somebody wanted to go in and kill him, they could. And so he fled. He tried to muster the courage to commit suicide, but kept losing his nerve. He even had his companions dig a grave for them, as though that would help. Like, if I could just see you dig a grave, maybe I can come to terms with the fact that I'm about to be put in it. And to calm his nerves, he even asked one of his companions to kill himself. He said, "Why don't you kill yourself? And if I watch you do it, maybe it will help me gain courage to kill myself." Of course, his companion refused. When he heard horses approaching, he had one of his companions stab a dagger into his neck. So Nero ultimately was not able to kill himself. He had someone else kill him. Uh, you know, he said, "What an artist dies with me," is one of the phrases one of the historians put on his lips, because he thought he was this great athlete, and this great musician, and this great actor, and what a loss it was to the world that his talent was disappearing with his life. Interestingly enough, these horses that were coming from the Senate were not there to kill Nero. They had decided that he can't be on the throne anymore. He'd done such a horrible job, but they didn't want to kill Nero because he was the last descendant of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which was thought to be a divine bloodline, god kings. And if Nero is dead, then that means we've killed the last representative of Julius Caesar and of Caesar Augustus. And so they didn't want to kill him, but he assumed the worst. And so he had his companion kill him right before they showed up. Now this is where the story begins to tie in with the book of Revelation. Almost immediately after Nero's death, A fear-fed belief that Nero was not dead, that he was alive and would return with horrible consequences began to spread. Many folks thought that he had actually fled to Persia and he would come at the head of the Persian legions and repay Rome what she deserved for betraying him. Now, this idea that he was going to come back led to many false appearances of people claiming to be Nero and that they belonged on the throne. The first false Nero appeared in July of the year 69. And this guy was a runaway slave from Pontus and had the advantage of looking like Nero and also being able to sing and to play the harp. So he was able to deceive a lot of people. He appeared in Greece where he mustered some support, but then he set sail for Syria, but was forced by a storm into an island where he was captured and killed. His body was taken to Rome through Asia Minor, where our 7 churches are who received the book of Revelation from John, and so they would know about this. The second false Nero appeared in 80 AD, and his real name was Trendus Maximus. He also apparently looked like Nero. He claimed that he had been living and hiding somewhere up to that time, and he appeared again in the province of Asia, where our 7 churches are. He acquired a few followers, but gained far more followers when he marched east toward the border. He had, in fact, some Parthians who supported him. Now, we don't know how his story ended, but the fact that he was in a group that was rebelling against Rome, and he teamed up with a group that was rebelling against Persia, the 2 great empires, means that this guy had no friends. Right? The Persians would have wanted to kill him. Emperor Titus, who is Domitian's brother, he was reigning at the time. He would have wanted to kill him, and that's probably what happened. This guy probably came to a miserable end. It just didn't survive in our sources. At least one more pretender appeared in the reign of Domitian in the year 88 or 89. Now, this one was a big deal. He created a lot of problems because he gained the support of the king of Parthia, posed a serious serious threat to the Roman Empire. Now, on the most probable dating of Revelation, these events probably would have been fresh in the memory of John and his first readers, right? Only 5 or 6 years before the book of Revelation was written. So he went over to Parthia and he said, look, my administration had an alliance with the Parthian Empire, and some usurpers have knocked me off the throne, and I've fled to you, and I need you to help restore me to the throne. Well, the Parthians believed him, and they contacted Emperor Domitian, and they said, look, you're an imposter, and you need to give Nero back his throne. Well, Domitian engaged in communication with them, and he eventually was able to persuade the Parthians, look, this guy is an imposter. He's taken advantage of you. He's taken advantage of this idea that Emperor Nero is going to come back, and he's trying to use that to take my throne, and you need to kill this man. Well, the Parthians were eventually persuaded by Domitian, and they put the man to death. Now, these are the 3 that we know about, 69, 80, 88, or 89, leading closely up to the time of the book of Revelation. And all of these would have been well known to the Christians in Asia Minor. So they would have understood this language of a king coming back after being killed. They would have definitely understood Nero's story to contribute some of the features to this aspect of the book of Revelation. A belief in Nero's return shows up as a popular belief as late as the year 422 with St. Augustine. Augustine records that this idea is still around in his time, and this is hundreds of years later. So this is a very powerful idea in the ancient world, very popular. So if Revelation is talking about Nero returning, how does that work? I mean, some folks will say that Revelation is depicting Nero returning as a diabolical superhuman, but most interpreters are not going to go that route. Here's another reading, which is probably a little bit more reasonable. The beast empire seemed to suffer sure death with the death of one of its heads, Nero, right? But after a year of civil strife, it healed with the ascent of Vespasian. So Nero dies, right? The beast represents the empire, and one of its heads is its king, it's Nero. Nero dies, and it seems like the whole beast is going to die. This makes sense historically because it looked like the Roman Empire was going to go down the tubes after Emperor Nero died. As I said, different people were laying hold on the throne. Nobody could really get a hold of it, and there was just unrest throughout the entire empire. Well, then Vespasian leaves from his battle in Judea and comes back to Rome, claims the throne. He's a popular emperor. He solidifies his reign for many years. He passes it on to his two sons, Titus and Domitian, and the beast seems to heal with the reign of Domitian. Some people think that this can explain the imagery. But I think, and I'm not alone in this, many scholars think this, that Emperor Domitian is the new Nero, and that what we have here is typological thinking. This makes sense to the early Christians. They do this a lot. For example, John the Baptist is the new Elijah, and it's not that he is Elijah in reincarnate form, it's just that he comes in the likeness and the spirit of Elijah. Jesus is the new Moses, not because he's Moses reincarnated, but because he is Moses. He's in Moses' likeness. He does what Moses does. He leads his people out of liberation, and he gives them the laws of God. There's a prophetess in Revelation's communities. We saw this early on, that she's called Jezebel. That's probably not her actual name. She's just like Jezebel. She is a deceiver. So this type of typological thinking was very common in the Jewish tradition and in Christianity. And so Nero was the first emperor to persecute the church. And now Domitian is persecuting the church. And so he is viewed as being a new Nero. Right? It's about typology. And any Antichrist figure in history, all the way up until the second coming, who persecutes the church, is a type of new Nero. I think this is probably going to prove to be the best type of logic to employ for these passages in Revelation. They worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?" It says that the dragon gave him his authority. Although rulers only reign by the providence of God, according to Romans 13, this does not mean that they are independent of demonic connections. To the contrary, we have seen in Deuteronomy 32 that when God divided up the nations at the Tower of Babel, that he placed the nations under the control of these angelic spirits. We have seen in Psalm 82 that those angelic spirits do not always do a good job when they rule over these nations on Yahweh's behalf, and they don't always do what is right. We've seen that in the book of Jubilees and in the book of Enoch and other early Jewish documents that discuss this idea that many of these spirits are in opposition to the Lord, even though they are employed, much the way that Satan still had the job of being a prosecutor, even though he had fallen from grace. So many of these angelic nations, these angels who represent these countries in the heavenly realm, they are engaged in evil things, and they influence these nations in evil ways. This is why in Luke chapter 4, Satan is able to say that all the nation states of the world are in his control. But nevertheless, these angels and these governments only have power because God has given them power. And all is not lost. Romans 13 states that God has put them in place in order to punish evildoers, and oftentimes the nations do exactly that. So we have a tension here, a tension that scholars refer to as the tension between Romans 13 and Revelation 13. Romans 13, where the governments have been installed by God and they're his servants, and then Revelation 13, where the dragon has given the nations their power and their authority. Now, whether you quote Romans 13 or Revelation 13 is a matter of wisdom. If the state is not persecuting the church, then it's a Romans 13 sort of day. If the state is persecuting the church, then you quote Revelation 13, where the state is aligned with the dragon. Whether you do Romans 13 or Revelation 13 is based on what circumstances you're in. Now, the reason I make this point is because there are many Christians who will quote Romans 13 and never quote Revelation 13. They'll never quote Psalm 2, or Psalm 110, or Daniel 2, or Daniel 7, etc. All these passages where the Messiah and his kingdom are ultimately in opposition against the rulers of the world and their kingdoms. That ultimately all the nations and their governments and their representative angels will have to step aside so that the Messiah and his people can reign and do it the right way, do it the way that the nations were not able to do. Many Christians in our context, especially in the United States, they quote Romans 13 and they don't quote any of these other passages. And these tend to be Christians who are very patriotic, who are very involved in political things, and they think that their political party is God's party and the other one is the devil's party, and they tend to think that their country was in the right in every war that it fought in its history, and they tend to be strong supporters of the national armed forces, that sort of thing. Guys like that read Romans 13 and they see it as giving an affirmative nod to their own identity, to their own patriotism, and to their own participation in national life. Now, I'm just saying, I don't want to cut Romans 13 out of the Bible, but guys like that are going to ignore a lot of biblical data, right? Because they like this idea that their country, particularly the United States, is God's country, and that we're a great Christian nation, and that the Republican Party is God's party, etc. And if you read Romans 13, you can really make that work, but you can't only read Romans 13. You have to read the other voices of Scripture, which show that ultimately the nations are demonic and meant for destruction. And so you should probably be very slow to associate your country with the kingdom of God, or to pretend that your country is God's favorite country. Emperors were believed to have received their power from the gods, especially from Zeus, also called Jupiter, the head of the Greco-Roman pantheon. This is interesting because it says here that the dragon gave his power and authority to the beast. You remember back in the early chapters of Revelation, we looked at Pergamum, which was the home of the great altar of Zeus, which is one of the wonders of the ancient world. And the text told us twice that Pergamum is the place where Satan's throne is. Now, this may be because of that city's connections to the god Zeus. They worship the god Zeus, who gives his power to Rome, but Revelation is saying, well, yes, Zeus does exist, but he's not really God. He is the head of the demons. He is the devil. And so these gods that the pagans worship are actually demons. And the head demon, Zeus, is actually the devil. Who is like the beast? Now this is a parody of the acclamation that is given to Yahweh many times in the Old Testament. And it says, who is able to make war with him? Again, the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 8, in Psalm 71, in Isaiah 44, in Micah chapter 7. This is language that the Old Testament writers use of God alone. But now the language that belongs to Yahweh is being used to praise the military power of the state. Now, I find this very interesting because in our American context, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower, we talk this way about the United States. Nobody can stand up to the United States. The United States has the world's greatest military, the world's greatest military assets, and we talk in a very idolatrous way when we talk about the United States. But notice that the way people are talking about the Roman Empire in the first century and praising its military as unmatched and as though it's invincible, Revelation counts this language, this military worship, as a type of blasphemy, as a type of idolatry. I think a point that is very important for us as American readers. The American military is not invincible. Yahweh alone is invincible. So we've had a lot of historical background information to introduce, and so we only got through 4 verses, but next week we will begin to look more at the beast and how he persecutes the church, and then we will see the second beast who rises from the earth, who assists the beast who rises from the sea.